Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Welcome to the 2024 Scary Stories Father's Day special. We've got close to an hour of Dogman and werewolf stories centered around fathers or fathers and sons. This special goes from the booger dog Dogman to a dogman in the boogie down Bronx. There's human dads who see werewolves, and there are father werewolves. This episode covers all your Father's Day upright canine carnivore needs, all in one place. So get out of Dad's chair. It's time for Dogman. My Father and the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories, NYC. When I was a kid, I ran away from home with my dad. We both hated my mother's rich family, and so we just departed for the swamps, where we hoped they would never look for us. We both knew the swampland was dangerous, and we thought we went in prepared. What we didn't know was that the swamp was also home to the rougarou, or the lougarou, which is basically very similar to what you call the Dogman. Both are legendary creatures, but I can assure you from personal experience that the kind of Dogman they say lives in the Louisiana swamps and bayous is very, very real. Now, during the first half a year we lived in the swamp, we were actually on a man-made raft with a sail made out of a couple of bed sheets sewn together. We pitched our tent on top and nailed it to the raft, and voila, our own houseboat of sorts. When we could, we'd camp on land, and when we caught fish or crayfish or whatever, we'd build a fire on shore to cook our catch. I remember it as the best time of my entire life, and I wish we could have lived that way forever. I'll never be that free ever again, and it was living that life that taught me how precious and valuable our freedom is. The first time we saw a dogman or rougarou, we saw two of them. In fact, we were surrounded by them and swamp, and I thought we were both goners. We were walking home from fishing to where we had set up a temporary camp on higher, drier ground, a bit inland. Suddenly, a figure jumped out at us from the bushes and blocked our forward movement. Turning around, there was another, larger figure now there. Although both were upright and bipedal creatures, neither was a human. For one thing, they were unclothed and covered in fur. The one in front was gray, and the larger one behind was a mix of various shades of brown and tan. They both had heads that looked more like dogs or wolves than apes or humans. While that's true, there was a weird vibe to their appearances. They genuinely looked like mixes between canines and people. I know the two species cannot interbreed, and that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, these guys both look like, well, werewolves. I figure that either of these were literally the rougarou that longtime New Orleans residents still talk about. Or else these were the kinds of animal that must have inspired the rougarou legends. Whatever they were real physical animals, because Dad and I could not both be imagining the same thing at once. Now, I hadn't had my big growth spurt yet, and that was a fortunate thing for me. Dad picked me up, tucked me under his massive arm like a football, and he ran directly at that somewhat shorter gray dogman creature in front of us. What I did to help was I screamed my fool head off. It was like Dad was doing a broken field run toward the end zone. I stopped yelling after we had to jerk left, and then jerk right, suddenly, to fake out that dogman. By that point, I was clinging onto my father as hard as he was holding onto me. I don't think what he did would have worked a second time, but since probably no other person or animal had ever run at that big predator before in its life, Dad had the element of surprise on his side. That dogman and I brushed against each other as my father leaped past him. His fur felt scratchy to me, not in any way pleasant to have to touch. It was such a brief moment, that's the entirety of my memory. Both Dad and I were shaking all over by the time we reached camp. We got out our defensive weapon as we also lit a fire, but the two Dogmen left us alone for the rest of that night. Maybe they had decided to hide in the shadows and study us. Maybe they were spying on us. Or maybe they moved on. I'll never know. The night did sound ordinary, though. The owls owled, and the frogs frogged, and the crickets cricketed. None of them seemed at all frightened of anything out there, so we took turns sleeping until finally we both woke up at dawn. After that, Dad started prioritizing us building ourselves a real house, or at least a real cabin. If we had a real place to stay inside with a permanent fireplace, he reasoned, we'd be much safer from not just the Dogman, but also the creepy crawlies and everything else out there in those swamps. The first thing we did was walk into town and get ourselves a lot of tarp. Then we were able to build a shelter that we could store dry wood inside of. Dad was chopping down trees and cutting them up into parts to build our little log cabin out of. We were not building on or by the water, but on what we hoped would continue to be dry land, and we were hidden extremely well in those woods. Since there were literally no roads or even a dirt path leading to the small wooden building, I can imagine how surprised anyone might have been if they happened upon it. I'm not sure anyone did, though, as I have no memories of ever seeing any human beings in or near our cabin. Yeah, definitely no human beings. But if you ask me about the Dogman, I'd have to give you a very different answer. We did see the Dogman out there, circling around in the night. Almost every night. It never ended, either. They never got bored of coming over to wander around our home, sometimes hiding, other times just openly staring. I'm not sure if they were trying to intimidate us, or if maybe they were just intensely curious. We went so long without seeing other humans near our home that we started to take our freedom for granted. That all ceased one day when Dad and I spotted my mother's lawyer and some other man parking their car about a quarter-mile from our cabin and getting out to look around the area. We were up on a hill at the time overlooking the road, but we took cover so as not to be seen. I can only assume they were looking for us, as they poked around as though looking for something. The other guy walked deeper into the woods when we heard the sound of a deep-voiced big dog barking in surprise and anger. That guy came racing out of those woods shouting something. They both dove into that car, made a U-turn, and got out of there. Both Dad and I thought they'd been chased off by the Dogman, so we hid a while longer to see what emerged from the woods. Nothing did, so we went home and began to pack up. It was time to move out of that area. We were about to be found out and have our freedom taken away from us again by my evil rich relatives. We headed north and east, and I don't remember if we ended up in the area of the DeSoto National Forest or the Bienville National Forest, but maybe we passed through both areas. Sometimes people we'd pass would invite us in for a real dinner. We'd tell them our stories about the Dogman and the Rougarou down south, and they would sometimes tell us about the cryptids they saw around there in Mississippi. For the most part, they were having to deal with wild men, or cavemen, or wood boogers. These all seemed to basically be one kind or another of Bigfoot. There was one family that said they saw elves outside. Elves and fairies who would do rude things like moon them from their windows. But usually people in and around those wooded areas in Mississippi, if they saw anything strange, it was almost always some kind of huge hairy man, or something they described as an upright walking ape. One time we were taken in for a night by a family who spoke both French and English, and they told us tales and legends of the Rougarou. I don't think most of those stories happened to that family. I think they were stories they had brought over from Europe, but they told us straight out, and openly, that these same creatures haunted the woods of the center of the USA, from the Mexican border, straight up and into much of the wilderness area in Canada. They were supposed to be especially present in the areas of Canada which had once been governed by the French. I have one last anecdote about those days, before my mother's lawyers succeeded in separating me from my father. The two of us were having dinner at the house of a more well-to-do family than usual. The kind father of this family of four invited us in. He had two daughters who were also friendly. I played out back with the one closer to my age, but when her mother came home, the tone changed. We were still allowed to stay for dinner because the father had promised us some food, but that mom made us eat it in the kitchen, not at the same table as her family. I was too young to take any of this personally, and I had a good time anyway. I started to tell one of our Dogman stories to the daughter who was my age, and the mother overheard. Then she threw a fit, saying I was trying to frighten her kid, and she ordered her husband to throw us out. When he stood up to her and refused, she grabbed our bags and led us to the back door, throwing both our backpacks out onto the ground behind her house. We picked them up and began walking away, but my father muttered something under his breath. This caused the rich lady to fly into a rage, and she walked along with us as we headed over her back lawn toward the forest, leading to some new place to camp. It was dark out, and we had never hiked in the dark before, so we were actually in a rush to leave. It was our goal to set up a camp as quickly as possible and get inside the tent. We didn't need dinner, so we just wanted some temporary shelter and some sleep. But as we marched away from the mansion, that lady kept pace with us, shouting out things that I guess might have seemed insulting to me if I'd been a little older. As it was, they just sounded like funny words, and I laughed at how her red face was almost turning purple. Well, she may have been entertaining me, but she was annoying someone else on that night. As her barking neared the woodline, another barking emerged from the woodline to greet her. It was the Dogman, it was a Dogman. This one was larger than the ones we'd seen down in the swamps. Those were my dad's height, but this one was a head and a half taller. It stood upright and had a long, shaggy brown coat of fur. I don't remember too much about its face, because as soon as I saw the big thing running out of the woods, my dad and I both dove to the side to give it room. The nasty lady ran back to her fancy house, screeching for someone to help her. I don't know who. The Dogman chased her back to the house, but sort of in the way she had chased us. It kept letting her get ahead, then catching up, then barking in her ear to keep her running. If I wasn't so scared of the Dogman because of our Louisiana experiences, I might have laughed. I wondered if we should help the lady, but Dad said come on, and we both just walked off into the woods to find a dry place to camp. So, since then, every June, I think back on those days of my father and the Dogman. 3 of my dad's booger Dogman experiences. Dear Scary Stories NYC, on Father's Day this year, I find myself thinking back on my father and his times. My dad was very old school. He farmed, he hunted, he fixed cars, and he claimed to have any number of experiences with a creature that had to have been a Dogman, but which he called a booger dog. This was years and years before I ever heard the term Dogman, and I don't know why my father would have made this stuff up. The booger dog, according to my daddy, was distinctly different from the wood booger, which was what we would call a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. I saw one of those with him once on a boat trip that we made into the swampland to see my grandfather shortly before he passed on. That was a terrifying day for me as a 13-year-old boy. Daddy told me to lie down in the boat and to pray silently when we first spotted that wood booger on the shoreline. After we got past it in peace, he told me that sometimes those things will throw boulders at your boat to try to sink you if they think you're acting too proud of yourself. You have to be submissive when you run into a wood booger, he told me, although even that is sometimes not enough if they happen to be in a bad mood on that day. The entire ride home, I kept low out of fear, and my daddy laughed at me the whole way. When we got back, he told Mama that her husband and daughter were home. I didn't appreciate that. Daddy expected me to grow up faster than I was able to, while telling me all the time that he was being overprotective. I really think each generation of us is weaker than the previous one, because my daddy always seemed like some kind of superhero compared to me and my generation. When my father would talk to me about the booger dog, he would ask me how scared I was by the wood booger Bigfoot that we had seen that day alongside the river. I would answer that I was as scared as I could imagine ever being. Then Daddy would say each time he ran into a booger dog, he was 10 times as scared as when he encountered the wood booger. When you see a wood booger, you can try and be submissive. You can try to sort of reason with him, Daddy explained. But when you're walking into a booger dog scenario, you just have to focus on survival or escape. There is no reasoning with a booger dog. Daddy lived his life on the outskirts of Texarkana. His younger days were east of there near Garland City in Arkansas. His final 25 years when he was semi-retired were spent west of Texarkana in a house near Redwater, Texas. I believe all of these stories date back to his days in a part of Arkansas that's less than a half-hour's drive to Fouke. If you don't remember, Fouke is the place they shot that documentary movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek. I don't mean any of the sequels or remakes. I'm talking about the original from the early 70s. When I saw that, I was out of college and an adult already, and I tried to take my father to see it too because it was about the wood boogers. Daddy refused to go, saying wood boogers are to be avoided. He liked to tell his stories, but he didn't want to hear anyone else's stories. They would just get him unnerved. It wasn't entertaining for him because he lived in the country, and I think he was afraid those things would reach in through the window, just like they do in that movie. It just hit too close to home for him, I guess. Anyway, here are some of Daddy's booger dog stories, told as well as I can remember. There are other stories too, but these are the ones I remember the best. I'm going to try to tell them from his point of view, writing as him. These are not actually in his own words, though, as Daddy never wrote any of this stuff down. I'll be paraphrasing throughout, but it should make sense if you pretend this is him talking. Number 1. The booger dog that chased me down a hill. Way back when I was just married, before I turned 20 years old, I came face to face with my first booger dog. I nearly died of fright, but I survived. That booger dog sure showed me who was boss, though. It happened like this. I was out hunting as usual. It was hot out, in the middle of the summer, when the bugs are extra thick, and the air is even thicker. I saw some varmint's tail coming out from under a bush. There wasn't any tail I was familiar with, and I didn't know what was in there. I could tell it was facing away from me, but that was it. I thought it might be a dog, so I whistled to see if it would react. If it was something wild, I was going to try and bag it for dinner, but if it was someone's dog, obviously I would want to spare its life. So like I said, I whistled, and the tail disappeared. Then the bush got all disturbed, like something was going to come on out of there. I held my rifle at the ready and waited to see what was going to happen next. I emptied my head of all fear, but also of all hunger and anticipation. If you let your stomach guide you, then you'll fire on anything. On the other hand, if you let your fear rule you, then you might miss your shot when you get a clear one. So I just watched, and I just waited. But instead of some critter moving left or right, or toward me or away, something rose upward. No lie, something started coming up out of that bush, and I backed off a whole lot really quickly. I was afraid it was going to be some other guy aiming right at my head. So I tore off about 20 or 30 feet away, got myself into a good defensive position behind a thick tree, and I peeked my head out. Well, what I saw made me feel dizzy. I felt like I was seeing something from the bottom of a bottle of bad moonshine. I blinked my eyes, and I pinched myself, but that thing was still there. So what did I see? I'll tell you, it looked like a living nightmare. It looked like God put that thing on this here earth just to be scary. Every way this thing could seem terrifying, it did so in spades. It had evil-looking eyes. It had an evil, prehistoric-looking mouth. It was like a dog, but it stood up like a booger. It had blood in its fur, so you could tell it wasn't groomed right. It seemed ill in the head, and that made it 10 times more scary. He was the last critter in the world that I wanted to pick any kind of fight with, and I wanted to let it know that somehow. I don't know what I was thinking. I wasn't dealing with no wood booger, which is probably part man. This was part dog and part devil. That's what this thing was. I backed away, continuing to look at it, but I pointed my rifle at the ground. The ammo I had in there wasn't going to take that thing down anyway. I had been out hunting small game. So I moved away, thinking that would make it leave me alone. Instead, that booger dog started barking like he lost his mind, and the next thing I knew, I saw him charging out of that bush, running toward me like he was in the Olympics or something. I tore back down that hill to the bottom where I had come into it. I was thinking that once we reached ground level, that booger dog was going to be running even faster. Once we got out of the wooded part back onto the path, I was going to have to do something to slow that thing down. So when I landed on the dirt, I turned around and I got myself down, taking aim at the woods behind me. When the giant critter would eventually run out, I was going to have to fire on him with what I had loaded, then take off running again. My hope was that I'd be able to slow him down a little bit and enable my getaway in the process. Well, that booger dog never came out of those woods. I don't know how far back he stopped chasing me. It was possible he was right inside that tree line looking out at me from someplace I couldn't see. Or he might have only fake charged me to get me running. Stayed quiet for a long time. But when I started hearing the insects again, I took my chance to get on out of there. Story 2. The booger dog that ruined my hunting stand. I spent the good part of an entire summer fixing up a hunting blind that I was sharing with my buddy Ned. He could use it on even-numbered days, and I had it on odd-numbered days. It was located in a prime spot, and we spent 6 or 7 weeks cutting branches out of the trees around it to improve the sight lines. We cut a few whole trees down, in fact, so it was about the best hunting blind that had ever been created. We could look in any direction, even behind us, and we'd usually be able to see whatever was down on the ground better than it could see us way up there on top of that thing. We had this really sophisticated, we thought, protection down on the bottom in case something like a bear spotted us up there, or a wood booger, or a cat. You know, something that knew how to climb up a tree. We cut some notches on the bottom part of the old tree we built it onto. Then about 20 feet off the ground, we had a barbed wire and metal fence kind of thing set up that could only be opened by one of the 2 keys that Ned and I owned. Past that was a ladder that we'd built right into it, so the rest of the long way up was far easier. Nothing had been able to get past our defenses, and so that hunting blind was as secure as it was useful. We felt like mad scientists, me and Ned. So one late afternoon, I was thinking about climbing on down out of there and going home because it was starting to get dark. I did a double take because I thought I saw a man wearing a gray fur coat heading my way. When I caught sight of him a second time, I saw that this guy's fur was his own fur, and his glowing eyes told me right off that I was dealing with a booger dog. Some of them, when it gets dark, their eyes glow like some kind of demon from hell. I seen one once that had red glowing eyes, but this one had eyes glowing this sort of off-white color, which is more common, at least in my experience. I had only seen, I think, 2 booger dogs in my life up to that point, and both times for less than a second before I had started running. I had a false sense of security up in that blind because I had never been messed with when I was in it before, so I took the opportunity to outright stare at that dog-headed thing. It looked like a wolf, except it stood up like a man and must have been 6.5 feet tall. Staring at that thing was a big mistake. Booger dogs have that same sense that we have. They can tell when someone's staring at them. Don't you know that critter looked straight up at me in my tree blind, and his eyes narrowed in hate. Even though I still felt safe up there, I'll tell you a chill went through me. After that thing's dog eyes zoomed in, it let out a high-pitched barking like it had just seen a ghost. The next thing I knew, it had run straight toward me, pushing trees and whatnot out of its way as it made a beeline for my tree stand. That was the first time I feared for my life in that hunting blind, as I didn't know if the thing was going to be strong enough and crazy enough to get through my defenses down below me. I could see clearly that the thing had hands like a giant raccoon, complete with opposable thumbs. Raccoons, as we all know, are excellent climbers, and this booger looked stronger than 4 men put together. Well, the thing tore into the tree trunk at the bottom, and I really couldn't see too well what he was doing at first. I had a good view of everything except what was directly beneath me, to be honest. I had a few weeks earlier set up a mirror in a nearby tree, pointed down to the base for security reasons, but leaves had grown up around it, blocking the view, and I had been too lazy and too overconfident to shimmy up that tree to fix it. I could hear the big beast doing something destructive down there. I just couldn't tell exactly what. I didn't hear any metallic noises, though, so I wasn't feeling like he was getting very far up that bottom level. Even though that thing was packed with muscle and had hands like humans or apes or raccoons, which can all climb very well, I don't think that booger dog had his brains wired in the correct way to climb. This creature may be some kind of a dog that is cursed in some way. Like a werewolf is a cursed man in the stories, I think this booger dog starts off as a dog, or a canine at least. It thinks like a dog so much that the idea of climbing just doesn't occur to it, because that idea doesn't occur to dogs. A cat will claw its way up almost anything, but the dog will remain on the ground barking up at that cat. In the same way, I think that the booger dog doesn't really understand yet all the different ways that his clawed hands could be useful to him. This is why I say that these creatures are less human than wood boogers, and why I am more afraid of them than anything else in nature. They are more destructive than they need to be, and they don't always need a reason to do something terrible. The booger dog is the only thing besides man that I know of that sometimes kills just because it can. Everything else kills for food or for self-preservation, but the booger dog will also kill for sport, or out of anger, or just to amuse itself. So, I was shaking all over, stuck in my hunting blind, listening to that booger dog trying to pull the entire thing down on top of itself. The idiotic thing got fixated on me and just wouldn't let up. Hours went by. I wanted to get out of there and go home, but I couldn't figure a way out. I could have risked unhooking myself from my seat and then tried to climb out on limbs and reach another tree, but even if I made it, that dog-headed thing would just follow me over there and trap me all over again. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there, trying not to have a heart attack from absolute fear. It wasn't until the first rays of light in the morning came that I could hear the insane beast stop doing whatever he was doing and walk away to whatever hell on earth he called home. I waited until he was long gone before lifting my stiff and achy bones on out of there and climbing on down. When I got through my locked metal gate, I saw that the rest of the way down had been torn to shreds by the creature. Not just tree bark, but shreds of the wood itself were all over the ground all around, and the trunk was half the thickness it had been before that booger noticed me up there, looking down on it. He hadn't succeeded in getting me down out of there, but he had seriously destabilized the base of that hunting blind and ruined almost 2 months of work by 2 grown men trying to create the greatest hunting blind in history. So let that be another lesson to you. If you see a booger dog, you better look away fast. Otherwise, he'll feel you looking at him, and he'll take it as a personal offense. Story 3. The booger dog that dug up my yard. It was these next 2 incidents that convinced me and your mother to pull up roots and move to Texas, as these made it all too personal and too dangerous. This was in the late 60s when you were away at college. That was back when your mother's cat Snookums passed on, God rest her soul. You weren't around, so you probably don't know how sad it made the poor woman. She wouldn't let me get her a new cat for near on a year out of respect for Snookums, and she made me bury her in the garden, where the cat liked to play and sleep. So the next night after the funeral, we heard strange sounds coming from the backyard. When we checked on it through a window, we were horrified to see one of them booger dogs digging up the poor cat's grave. That's another thing I think these are cursed dogs turned into hellish creatures and not just a normal breed of predator. The desire to pull dead things out of graves, that's something a ghoul would do. It just seems unnatural and wrong to me. I made your mother go back to bed and I went out back to make noise and scare that thing off. I put a big stone slab over the grave to keep out the predators. You remember that stone. It was right in the middle of your mother's garden and a constant reminder of her loss. My temper toward the booger dog had reached a boiling point, and the next thing that happened just pushed it all too far for us to put up with it any longer. Your mother was washing the dishes in the kitchen one night when that dog-headed freak came right up to the window and stared right in at her. She screamed and broke some dishes and the thing ran off, but that was the last straw. They had gotten so brazen as to come right up to us, inches away, and just stare into our home like they were the landlord or something. They had decided there were no boundaries between us and them, and it was only a matter of time before there was going to be violence, or maybe something a lot worse than that. This was when we contacted real estate people and put our old place on the market. We were in our new home near Redwater before Christmas. It's only 20 or 25 miles west of Garland City, but it's on the other side of Texarkana, and I just don't think booger dogs are as plentiful over here. At least, we've been mostly left alone since our move. And that ends that story. I do remember one more Dogman story my father used to tell, but that one is pretty violent, and it made my daddy cry to tell it. If you want that story, just let me know. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed my retelling of 3 of my daddy's booger dog, Dogman experiences. Father Werewolf and Son. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I recently saw an episode on your channel about a big werewolf or dogman walking with a young one. So I'm quite excited to see that another person has had this kind of an experience. I was treated like I was crazy for years by my family. In fact, I don't expect this to change anything as far as they go. But I am grateful for the validation at least. So now I'm going to tell you about what happened to me. I hope you take it as a warning or a cautionary tale, in case you see something strange yourself. Be very careful who you share this information with, or you could be putting roadblocks up to prevent your own future happiness and success. There was a kid I was best friends with for a while who I used to call Kirk, because he was a leader type of guy like Captain Kirk. Later, his family fell apart and he ended up in a mental facility. It was really sad. Having cruddy parents can actually ruin your life and drive you insane. I saw it happen to Kirk. Used to be really outgoing in the life of every class and game and party. After his parents started suing his siblings with frivolous lawsuits to deliberately drive their own offspring into poverty, Kirk became withdrawn and unsure of himself. All of his confidence was gone once he realized his family were such low animals. He felt ashamed, as if it were he who had performed the inexcusable acts of his parents. After not very long, it drove him bonkers. Not the fun kind of bonkers either, I mean the serious kind, where he's never been let out of that facility since. So before I even tell you my story, you already know that my only other witness is literally in an insane asylum. So I don't blame you if you want to join my family in calling me as crazy as my fellow witness Kirk. With all of that out of the way, I will now begin to try to tell you the story both for myself and for my friend Kirk, who sadly can't be among us to speak for himself. I was 18 when this happened, and Kirk had just turned 19 shortly prior. I remember because he had a flip phone with him, which back then was a new kind of cell phone. This was before iPhones and smartphones, but it did take pictures. The coolest part about those cell phones was that they would flip open, like the Captain Kirk TV communicators. My friend Kirk did it just like second season Kirk on TV. Look in one direction dramatically, flip the phone open casually with one hand without looking. So this was an event in our lives. Kirk finally had his communicator. I myself didn't have a cell phone yet. Anyway, that means it had to have been early or mid-November when this happened, since Kirk was born 2 days after Halloween. The year I am certain was 1999, because Kirk and I were both scared of that year. We had heard stories that it was going to be the end of time or the end of civilization. Well, maybe that last part is turning out to be true. But anyway, we were very conscious that it was the year 1999 while this was all going down. The two of us had decided to spend the weekend hiking and camping around the Kincaid Woods area in Boonton, New Jersey. That's right, I said New Jersey, not Pennsylvania. Anyway, we drove out to the end of Powerville Road, parked the used car my mother had given me for my previous birthday, and started walking into the woodline. That night we stayed up after dark telling scary stories for a while. But I got tired early and I went into our tent to crash. After a while, Kirk came in and woke me up, saying there was something I had to see outside. I got up and went out into the chilly night with him, but whatever had been there was gone. I asked him what he had seen, but he was too embarrassed to say, and he told me it might have been an optical illusion or something. I remember I kind of got annoyed at him, and I tried to go back to sleep, but now my feet were cold and sleeping was impossible. Eventually I just decided to get up a little bit before dawn and get started on my day. It was about then that Kirk finally went inside the tent to crash out. He was snoring almost immediately, and when I heard the sound, at first I thought that's what it was, snoring. By the sound, I mean the sound of the adult Dogman or Werewolf or whatever that was. It made a few noises, but they were each sort of timed to the snoring of my friend inside the tent, so I was laughing at the bizarre snoring that Kirk was doing. I wasn't even noticing that anyone else was there, until I turned and saw the two of them. Almost immediately I felt my stomach drop because I was thinking this had to have been what Kirk woke me up about earlier. It was still mostly dark when I was seeing them, but it had to have been close to pitch black out when Kirk had. As much as he was unsure about what he was seeing, that's how much I was sure. No, it wasn't the noonday sun, it was still very early, but it was just light enough, and they were just dark enough, that they were easy to make out in silhouette. And they had these glowing eyes that made them appear to have risen up from hell itself. These were monsters I was seeing, and the only thing keeping me from fainting dead away was that they were walking perpendicular to me, from my right to my left, and I didn't think they had seen me. I couldn't be sure at the time that they were even interested in me. They were very interested in each other, but not in me. The first thing I can think of to compare this scene to is a parent walking their kid to kindergarten or first grade. There was a big, hairy monster, like a Bigfoot, only with a dog face, and he was holding hands with this cute little creature that looked like a real-life charcoal black-colored teddy bear. It was a big werewolf and a teddy bear walking through the woods together. I didn't know what species those were, but I figured they must be some kind of bear with pointed ears that walks upright. I snuck into the tent as quietly as I could, and I woke Kirk up, telling him to be quiet. When I went back outside, he followed me, and then the two of us stood there for a while, transfixed, as we got to witness two of the rarest creatures in all the world walk along like they were on their way to the school bus. The big one was a male, not a female as I had first assumed when I saw it leading the little one. No, this was a male, even in silhouette. I could clearly see that. If it was a bear, it must have had mange, as its chest and belly had no hair on them as far as I could see. It looked like he hit the gym a lot, and there was no body fat on this guy at all. On the adult, I mean. The kid was a little round furball on legs, as I remembered. You almost wanted to say, "Aw," when you saw him. Or her. I mean, who knows? That was a moment I still have dreams about. I wake up into those dreams as though I were really there, in those woods. When it happened, I was scared. My stomach hurt. My feet were cold, and I was afraid I was going to pee on myself. In the dreams, though, it's like the perfect immersive virtual reality replay, where I'm no longer scared or uncomfortable, and I can just study the creatures and enjoy the once-in-a-lifetime privilege of getting to witness something like that. When I look at Kirk in those dreams, though, everything goes wrong. I remember that was the last weekend we got to spend with each other before his family imploded through controlled demolition carried out by his parents against him and his siblings. I also remember how Kirk ruined our last perfect moment, and I remember how he did it. The cell phone. The Captain Kirk flip phone. That was what started everything rolling downhill, both on that night and in Kirk's life in general. And how could a flip phone destroy an entire life, you ask? Well, Kirk took his out and tried to take a flash photo of the two upright hairy creatures walking by. Those of you who are my age or older may remember that the cameras on those old flip phones took tiny photos, 640 by 480, and they really needed to be taken in a bright location to have anything come out at all. The exposure time was usually so long that it was very hard not to get blurred images, and the flash did not flash very far at all. So when Kirk took his flash photo, the flash lit up some tall grass and a flying bug in front of him, while everything else in the photo came out a dark, muddy, splotchy brown. We wouldn't learn that until later because the two of us suddenly had something far more pressing to deal with. Now, while that flash did not extend far enough to light up the two creatures, it did get noticed by the two werewolves and they both turned and saw us. I was watching the big giant one. It looked like the most muscular man ever, but it also looked tired, as though being a father were taking every ounce of its strength every single day. Parts of its fur looked normal, but other parts looked mangy and straggly. Still, he had to have been 10 feet tall if he was an inch, and I began wondering how fast he could run at me if I turned tail right then and made a break for it. None of that ended up mattering, though. The big dog-headed werewolf monster never did anything except stand there and stare at us. The cute little son that looked like a teddy bear, though, he charged at us, making this sound that was like a whine half the time and sort of like chittering the rest of the time. He reminded me of that little fetish doll from that old Karen Black TV movie from the 70s, except he wasn't carrying a spear. He was equipped with teeth and claws. Even so, he had looked so small and cute next to the Dogman that I didn't immediately react to his charging at us. The little guy was mostly running on two legs, but he would drop down to leap over rocks and roots in his way, and at one point I saw him grab onto a tree trunk and swing around it. Now, I didn't see it do that with hands. I saw it do that with long, curved claws that reminded me of grappling hooks. It had a series of 3 or 4 little Wolverine adamantium-looking claws that it could swing from, and they looked long and sharp enough to tear my guts open. Couple that with the fact that a creature who looked tiny next to a huge Dogman didn't look so small anymore once it started getting closer to us. I think that thing was probably 4 feet taller when standing up straight, even though he had looked 2 or 3 feet tall walking next to its parent or guardian over there. So it was a delayed reaction, but Kirk and I ran away. We ran away from our own tent, from our own campsite. Once I saw those claws, I didn't think I'd be safe inside the tent. So I ran, and so did Kirk. At first we ran together, me and my friend. Every so often I'd turn and find that smaller creature still on our tail. He never seemed to catch up, but he never lagged back either. The sounds he was making were scarier than any animal sounds I'd ever heard. He didn't seem like he was fooling around. We had, or Kirk's camera had, really ticked this little guy off, and he was looking to get even, plus more. I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing the creepy monster slice a branch thicker than my fingers off a tree without even putting much muscle into it. I didn't want to think what those grappling hooks might be able to do to me, and I guarantee you that I ran faster than I ever had before. At some point, Kirk and I became separated, which proved to be good luck for me and bad luck for Kirk. The creature chased Kirk all the way to his home, and I've always felt that the trauma caused by that led into his later breakdown. He might have been able to handle the evil machinations of his parents if he hadn't been heading into it broke and coping with trauma that he wasn't even allowed to talk to anyone about. The few times he was honest about the Dogman, he got emotionally abused in return. It wasn't really fair for Kirk, and that was how I learned that life is not fair. A lesson learned from a little baby teddy bear Dogman.
Find that link in the description, honey.
My dad saved Dogman's life. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My dad told me a story about the Dogman that blew my mind. He told me it happened to him personally, and he looked me in the eye when he told the tale. According to my father, he once saved the Dogman's life from a bunch of hunters. On the one hand, I wonder, did Dad prevent all of us from having proof that Dogman is real? And on the other hand, I wonder if Dogman is more human than we know, and if the creature should in fact be protected from harm by law. Now, I grew up in Los Angeles, but my father only moved there when I was a baby. In fact, he and I are both Wisconsin natives, even though I don't personally have any memories of the place myself. Dad and Mom met and got married in Wisconsin and then had me. Then a job opportunity brought them out west before I was even 3 years old. But in the days before he met my mom, my father hung out with a bunch of friends who mostly enjoyed going on hunting and camping trips together. I don't know anything about hunting, so I apologize in advance if I don't know enough to give you too many details about what kind of weapons or ammo they had or what they were intending to be hunting. So the story starts as the group of men wanders through the woods and comes upon the stench of death. With a little more investigation, they discover a recent kill being devoured by a very large wolf. The men agree that's the largest and strangest looking wolf they've ever seen, and they prepare to back away slowly, not wanting to give the wolf the impression they intend to steal his dinner from him. Animals get extremely hostile if they think you want their food. That's one of the few things I know about nature. So everybody was in the process of leaving when my dad sees the dog stand up on his hind legs, and he's stunned. The dog walks over to a different area and looks off in the distance as though searching for something. My father stopped the other guys and pointed out the human behavior being exhibited by this canine animal. The men were transfixed as the creature finished looking for whatever it was looking for, then walked like a man back to his meal and went back to eating. "That's no dog," one of the men whispered. "That's the freaking Wisconsin werewolf." The men were in agreement that they were looking at a real, living Wisconsin werewolf. But past that, they agreed about nothing. One guy wanted to bag the Dogman, and another wanted to attempt to trap it. Someone else thought they should wait till he finished eating, then track him back to his lair. My father kept his opinions to himself, though. Dad told me that when he looked at this animal, he saw a man. Although the head was canine, with tall dog ears on top, the body was really more human than dog. Dad wondered if the soul were human or canine, just because it's killing and eating with its hands. That didn't make it primitive in Dad's mind. If he were driven to starvation, could he really say he might not do the same thing that beast was doing? He was doing what he needed to do to survive, and it was savage and ugly. But that didn't mean the soul inside the creature had to necessarily be savage as well. My father said that if he had a camera with him, he would have wanted to take a photo, but he didn't want to take anything else from that Dogman, and he most certainly did not want to take its life. He knew that making that argument out loud to the others would get a loud negative reaction, and he would lose their trust. So as I mentioned earlier, he kept his opinions to himself. I interrupted Dad at this point, wanting to understand the creature's anatomy a little bit better. Did it have paws? Or did it have hands? Dad responded to this with a sigh and said it was sort of hard to explain, but he'd try. The hind legs of the creature had dog paws, same as any other canine. So did the front legs, which became the arms when it stood bipedally. But the paws in front were so large, and the dew claw more conveniently placed, so the front paws did function more like hands than, say, bear's claws. The Dogman's front paws in fact do resemble a bear's, except that, as I mentioned, there is the one claw offset from the others that can be used almost in the same way as a thumb. It can grip things and hold them, and Dad said he saw him using his paws that way while eating. So the men quarreled quietly, not being able to decide what they were going to do about this Dogman. It got pretty heated, and the next time the Dogman stood up to take a walk, one of the men grew afraid that he was about to run away. Completely losing his cool, the guy stood up, and without the agreement of the others, he took a pot shot at the beast. He missed by a mile, and only succeeded in creating a one Dogman stampede. Bushes and branches were loudly pushed aside as that Dogman ran away for his life. Immediately, all the men ran in pursuit. It's a predator's instinct to chase something that's running away, and human beings are a predatory species, whether we like to accept that or not. Dad said that sometimes the Dogman ran on his hind legs, sometimes he ran down on all fours, sometimes he resembled an ape in his gait, and sometimes he leaped onto branches and swung himself like some sort of canine Tarzan or a Spider-Man. It was all the men could do to keep him in their sights, but they managed to track him to a cave, and they saw him run inside. My father knew that cave, but none of the other men did. Again, Dad kept what he knew and what he felt to himself, and began to formulate a plan. One of the men suggested creating a fire to smoke the Dogman out, but Dad finally decided to speak up. "No, don't start a fire," he insisted. "It'll only drive him out the back exit of this cave, and then we'll lose him for good." Understanding suddenly that my father had a familiarity with this cave that they lacked, the men quieted down and listened to him with complete attention. He gave the others directions to go in, so they could cover the back exit of the cave. Then he said he himself would start the fire in the front of the cave and drive the creature back to them. He told them he'd wait for 20 minutes to know the men had reached the other cave entrance, and then he would start the fire. They should remain in that position for at least 40 minutes or an hour to give the smoke time to fill the cave and force the Dogman out into their laps. The men all excitedly agreed and trudged off into the woods, following my father's directions. Those directions were detailed, and those directions were accurate, except they led to the entrance of an entirely different cave, which was not connected in any way to this one. With luck, those guys wouldn't figure out the trick for another hour and a half, so that was the time the Dogman had to get himself to safety. Hiding in the bushes in a spot that afforded him a clear view of the cave entrance, Dad sat and waited to see if the Dogman would emerge and get away. Remaining silent for 15 or 20 minutes, the scene had definitely mellowed out. Eventually, Dad said he saw this yellowy off-white eye shine inside the cave, peeping out. Tentatively and slowly, the Dogman approached the entrance and looked out and around. Then he sniffed the air, and suddenly his head turned directly toward my father's hiding spot. The Dogman's nostrils flared, and he growled loud enough that Dad could hear him from where he was. So then my father told me he did something that I personally would never have the nerve to do in 1,000,000 years. He stood up, showing the Dogman himself and his rifle. Then he dropped the weapon to the forest floor and showed the palms of his hands to demonstrate that he was defenseless. Now to me, that's crazy. If I saw a Dogman, I would want him to think I was armed, not unarmed, you know? It's like he was inviting the creature to tear him apart. The very brave gamble paid off, though. The Dogman saw his chance and ran off on his hind legs, disappearing into the woods and out of sight completely. Well, Dad lost those friends, but he said it was worth it. The Dogman was too much like a man for him to allow the others to gun him down like a criminal. That was the end of Dad's hunting period in his life, and it actually led to him meeting my mom and fathering me, so I guess it's all good, as they say. In fact, you might say I never would have even come into existence if the Dogman hadn't come between Dad and his friends. He might still be out there with them to this day, and he might never have met my mom. So for that reason, I'd like to say a little thank you to that Dogman in that cave for unintentionally playing matchmaker and giving me a chance to be alive. It's still hard for me to accept that my entire existence only happened because my dad saved Dogman's life.
If you want a coloring book full of monstrous delight, then give this a look. It'll give you a fright, right? Scary stories, coloring book, werewolf coloring book. And just to make your mind explode, it's a digital download. All it costs is $2.09, and then you will be feeling fine. Coloring monsters today, it's a coloring book, hooray. Okay, link is in the description.
I hope you've enjoyed the story so far. We've got one final one, and this one's personal to me, as it happened to my own father. Here's a clip of me telling the true tale. Happy Father's Day, everyone. I've never seen a Dogman or a Bigfoot or anything of that nature. My excuse is that I live in New York City, so how could I see one of those things? But I was reminded recently of a story my late father used to tell me about the time when he was convinced he saw a werewolf, and this was in the Bronx. I told this story a long time ago on this show, but I couldn't find my original recording or script, so I'm going to have to retell it from scratch and hope I get it right. This was the mid-1950s. My father was a young guy, maybe 20, and he was new at driving a cab. It was the full moon on a cold night in the Bronx, and when a certain call came in, The dispatcher and his friends started chuckling among themselves. Then they called my dad over, who was a big Irishman, bigger than I ever got to be, and they told him to go pick up someone that they said was a regular customer. This guy would only call for a cab once a month, and he always wanted to be taken to the same place. My dad was warned to treat this guy well, as he was a regular paying customer. Whatever he wanted, just do your best to accommodate. Okay, fine. So my big fearless father drives out to the address he was given, and he picks up this scrawny, short, ratty-looking guy. He gets in wearing a scowl, and he sits there wearing a scowl. My father asks him where to, and the guy gives him the address for Woodlawn Cemetery. Now, it was after dark, and my father was pretty sure that Woodlawn Cemetery wasn't going to be open at that hour. He started to say something like that to the little emaciated-looking guy, and that guy shut my father up with a growl about how he should do his job if he wanted to earn his keep. So my father shut up, and he drove as quickly as he legally and safely could toward the requested destination. Meanwhile, the guy in the back seat was getting tenser and tenser, making this sound that wasn't far off from a growl. So finally my father pulled up to the corner of Woodlawn Cemetery in the middle of the night, and the guy jumped out of the back of the cab. He went running to the fence around that graveyard, and somehow this little weak-looking guy climbed and vaulted the fence with very little effort, disappearing somewhere inside. I would always ask, where'd he go next? To which my father told me he didn't care. I asked him, didn't he want his fare? That guy didn't pay his fare. But to my father, that guy was a werewolf. He needed to get to the cemetery at night during the full moon. Therefore, he was a werewolf, and there was no questioning this fact, at least as far as my father was concerned. He didn't care that he didn't get paid. He learned a life lesson, which is, be careful who you let into your cab on the night of the full moon in the Bronx. Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos, or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.